Good evening, Tom. How are you? It's great to speak to you on the same time zone.
Yes, and it's good to see you. Good to see you. Looking very much. You look like a cross between a sort of walnut and a prune.
I must have a word with the lighting engineers in here.
Yeah, well, please do. Make it more subdued if you can. Do us a favour. Welcome home. Well, listen, welcome home, Simon. I hope the welcome home party was there for you. I booked the pipe band.
The flight must have been delayed or something.
Oh, don't tell me they weren't there, were they? They told me.
I maybe never noticed I was so cold.
That could be. Well, it's nice to see you back anyway. And
thanks, Tom.
You've come back just in time for the good weather.
Yeah, well, it seems to have taken a wee turn for the better. Yeah. It's the first day of spring, I think, so we're doing well.
Absolutely.
Before I get into our podcast this week, our deep dive team, who've been very busy this week, a real range of cases for us, from terrorism to, you name it, to Pitchfork, got some landmark cases as well. Yeah. I wanted to just touch base with you because we've sold out our Mitchell Library live event for that Thursday night. There's no more seats. How do you like that?
I saw that, and it's a big venue, so that's super.
I'm saying sold out. It's a free event, but you get the idea.
Yeah, well, it shows a lot of interest, and I'm delighted about that. It's going to be super. And the Mitchell Library is such a lovely place.
Yep. And after that, on the 27th, another Thursday night, we've got a night in the Three Craws in Edinburgh Inn up at Jordan Hill across from the train station there. Mm-hmm. I spoke to the manageress the other day, and the tickets, she's quite happy that things are going well. We're not sold out yet, but that'll be another great night. A wee change for us in a public house with a licence.
Absolutely, but you'll have to moderate your behaviour. I mean, you've been not bad in the library, but get you in a pub, Simon. I'm not that.
We're taking a chance, aren't we?
Taking a big chance.
Especially if any of my old pals or colleagues turn up, it will turn into a riot.
Oh, hopefully not.
If all the people I owe money turn up, we're in trouble.
I was going to say another thing this week, Simon, just to say to you that the BBC ran last week the story of Peter Tobin. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you saw it, but I watched it.
I did.
An excellent programme. And just to remind our listeners, we actually covered that case in season 3, episodes 13 and 14. So, you can, if you don't want the BBC version, if you want the true version, then go to season 3, episode 13 and 14 of Crime Time Inc.
That's interesting, Tom, and I know what you mean by that because it's pretty much why we started this, because we were getting tired of speaking to the media and only seeing wee clips of what suited them to show on programmes or whatever. We could speak to them for hours on end, and it ends up a 2-minute clip that bears no resemblance. So it's really why we do this, to get to the nitty-gritty of things and explain to people how things happen behind the scenes, behind the blue line.
Yeah, and with our emphasis, because what frustrates me, and I did a piece for the Tobin thing, because I was the divisional commander out in West Lothian when Vicky Hamilton disappeared. But the thing gets me, and I'm not saying about this programme in particular, but things that always concern me is that I think there's a particularly important point of emphasis, and quite often when you watch the clip, they haven't included that. They've included something else. And I find myself shouting at the television, but what about this? And what about
Yeah. And everybody's got their own take on these things as well. It's what I've learned from listening to our audience. Everybody hears a different thing. They focus on a different part of the story. So it's important that you and I try and look at it from different aspects, which is what we do here.
Yeah.
Tom, some really interesting news this week from our team. Chris tells me that we put up a TikTok video. It was a clip of a piece you and I did about Thompson through here, Arthur Thompson, Paul Ferris. It was just a clip from our episode a couple of weeks ago about Arthur Thompson. It was about in particular on that occasion. And it went absolutely fantastic. And apparently there's over 55, nearly 60,000 views on TikTok.
I know, I saw that. Very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I saw it. Again, it's another medium that we'll have to get into. I did get a surprise because I saw the message from Chris and it was the TikTok video, 55,000 views. I thought, that's not a video of Simon, is it? 55,000 people? No, surely not. But honestly, it was a great wee video, and it just shows you these are things we've got to, as we grow and as we learn.
Yes, it reminded me of the wee story that I told in my book. In fact, Paul Ferris communicated with me about it. He was saying about his side of the story, if you like. He still has court papers and whatnot. When I was a very young detective, I had just made detective and I got posted to Rossi on the Isle of Bute. I'd get asked to recce a house and to check for a car before the squad came over. It was the chief super, Mr. Young, through here in Strathclyde, that you probably knew. He phoned me up and asked me to do this, and I did it, and they sent the crime squad across. It was about 10 months before I went into the series crime squad. And I was there when they arrested Ferris in his flat, a top landing flat. But I didn't have a gun. They didn't give me a firearm. In fact, my boss, Ian Gillis, the superintendent, told me, don't take a firearm. Just stay in the background, show them where to go and let them go on with it. He knew to keep me out of it. So I was keeking round the close, onto the stair, onto the landing, when the 4 crime squad chapped the door and Paul answered the door in his dressing gown. And they jumped on him, put him down, the firearms were out. And the only thing I really remember about it is seeing the guns in his face and hearing the comment from Paul as he looked up at them without a nerve in his body. And all he could say, Tom, was, is that a Smith & Wesson snub-nose, big man? That's the only comment I heard him making. Cool as you like.
Grace under pressure, eh?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, this week, Pitchfork, Colin Pitchfork, a big case, as it turns out, in history in the 80s. And it struck me when I was listening to it, it was around the time, Tom, that you had the World's End murders on your books, that you had other things going on. DNA was becoming a big part of inquiries even back then. But nobody other than your forensic team, it seems, could see the future of that and how valuable it would be to maintain and retain the evidence.
Yeah, the Pitchfork case is interesting. Pitchfork was an abominable character. And the one thing I couldn't figure out, that there was a couple of attempts, and in fact he was given parole at one point in time. Yeah. How and why that was, thankfully, the Lord Chancellor revoked that and he was sent back to prison. Pitchfork was a multiple murderer, and his was the first case to be proven by DNA. His case set the standard. And after that, the DNA database, the national database, started. And after that, people took the lead. And I think during the Robert Black case, I talked about Operation Catch'em, which was an operation to take DNA swabs from prisoners who'd been convicted of certain categories of crime within the prison system. And of course, that's how, in the end, we caught Angus Sinclair. So if you want to look at the lineage of it, really, and say, how did we catch Angus Sinclair? Then you've got to go back and you've got to look at the success of the Pitchfork case and say that was the genesis of it, really. So a hugely important case from that point of view. And of course, as we've said before, Simon, the key to it was these murders had taken place several years before. These 2 young women, both of them identical murders, but several years apart. The key to it was that the officers had taken the materials properly and had preserved them properly so they could give up their secrets. So it's really the same learning points. But what the Pitchfork case did was it opened our eyes to what DNA could do, and it set an awful lot of people off on the thing. Because before that, many people had thought of DNA as being useful to eliminate people, particularly in rape cases. But the Pitchfork case really opened our eyes to the investigative possibilities of DNA. To that extent, it was groundbreaking and hugely important.
There's 2 things there, one, Tom. The last one that you mentioned was that it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's not just a tool of the police and investigation. It is a tool of elimination as well. And it's probably been just as useful to defend innocent people over the years as it has been to prosecute criminals. Because
we had good DNA from Helen Scott's coat way back in 1977, when DNA came online and we managed to get a profile from it, we managed to eliminate a dozen more suspects. We had the usual things: a suspect with a conviction for rape, a well-known criminal, couldn't quite tie down his alibi, loose ends to it. They were there kind of hanging about, bothering us without there being anything positive. And what DNA did was said, well, this person might be a violent criminal, and we don't like him, but actually it wasn't him.
Yeah. Or even confessed, because you and I know that people confess to things and there's no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever.
Yep.
The other thing about it, Tom, was that I wanted to emphasise with you, because you're in the prime position to do this, because you can see it from its inception way back then, before we knew anything about it, is the process of something becoming so valuable. It has to be guarded like fingerprints were. It has to be meticulous for the law to catch up with it and accept it as genuine and factual evidence. The science behind it and the providence of the evidence and the science behind the investigation has to be meticulous, doesn't it? 100%. That's where we always go back to Ruxton. That taught us that, if nothing else.
Absolutely. Yes. And what we should remember is that within science, there is no 100% exactitudes. Fingerprints and DNA at the end of the day is about expert opinion and about probabilities. It's about probabilities. And that's what you'll hear people say. DNA matches. It is 1 in 20 million. It is 1 in 100 million. There's always a mathematical probability. And you're absolutely right. All it would need is for one of these cases to be badly handled and it turn out not to be the person, and the whole evidential credibility of DNA or fingerprints of any other scientist would be discredited. That's why it's got to be 100%. I mean, that's why I think I've spoken to you about this before. We knew that it was a fingerprint of somebody, but there wasn't 16 points of comparison. There was only 12.
Yeah.
Now, any fingerprint expert will tell you, if you've got 12 points of comparison, that's the same person. But the law says 16. And time again, I would have fingerprints, guys would come and say, look, we've got a 12-point print on such and such, so-and-so. Can't use it, but you're fishing in the right pond. You'll have to find other evidence, which we had to go away and do. And it's a very high bar, and it's right to be a high bar.
It's that East Coast evidence thing. I can't get my head around it at all.
It's too late now, Simon. Don't even try. It's too late. Too late. Too late.
So Pitchfork was a big learning curve, and it's something that we do come back to time and again on Crime Time Inc., because these cases punctuate history for us and show us where the learning points were and where the progress was made. Even in the podcast itself that our deep dive team did, they were great at explaining how we've now moved on. You've mentioned this before, as familial DNA, which is a big tool now. Things have moved on a lot in the last 20, 30 years, Tom.
Low copy number DNA, lasers in order to detect DNA. Things are moving on rapidly. And as I've often said, if it's 6 months since you have got up to date on DNA, you're out of date.
That's the same with digital crime. A bit of a theme for us this year to make people aware of the dangers of digital crime out there. It's changing so quickly, and criminals are usually at the forefront of that change because they're looking for weaknesses in the systems that they can make money from. Okay, Tom, the second episode of our Crime Time Inc. deep dive this week was within both our times. 22 years ago, the London bombings. Yeah. Did you have much knowledge of it at the time? You were still in the job?
Yeah, I was. Yes. And I always thought that the London bombings were perhaps the greatest test of the police service that I ever witnessed. It really did test the whole of the structure, almost to breaking point, and how we coped with suicidal terrorists loose in a big city. How you cope with that. To some extent, there's no complete answer yet. And fortunately, the trend discontinued here in this country, but this really did test us. And of course, there were two. There was 7/7 and 21/7, 2005. It was in the middle of the big conference up here in Scotland. And so a lot of resources, specialist resources, were up here for the huge summit. And there were suicide bombers got onto underground trains and a bus in London, and absolute carnage. And there was every expectation that there were others as well. And of course, on 21/7, that proved to be the case, although fortunately, the second team, the second lot, were not so adept as the first lot. I'm not saying they weren't as dedicated and they wouldn't have killed themselves, but they didn't get the chemical combination right in their explosives, and they weren't as successful. But it was a huge problem. And there was a very good documentary series on the television just a few weeks ago about the London bombing. And I would recommend anybody to watch it, because they had a lot of contributions from the people who were there, including the commanders, most of whom I had met, Andy Hayman, a lot of people like that, talking about, what it was like then and the decisions they had to make. In between the investigation, there was the absolute tragedy of the shooting of John Charles de Mendes, who was an innocent man who was caught up literally in the confusion, and who was shot dead by police officers on the train, completely innocent. It was I remember the Menendez killing and thinking, oh dear, this is the end of it. It was dreadful. But it was all about systems. We often speak about systems, good people, good systems. And what happened there was Menendez was shot by mistake because we'd had to call the military, the army were on the ground, the SAS were on the ground, because we were so concerned about all of this. Hundreds of police officers that had been sent north to Scotland to police the big event up here were sent back down, and there was a mix-up over radio communication as to the status of John Charles de Mendes, because John Charles de Mendes was seen and he was a suspect because of his appearance, and that was translated into the police radio system, meant that he was actually a bomber. And I feel very, very sorry for these firearms officers who went onto that train to arrest Menendez, because they were rushing into certain death, is what they were doing. And they shot him, they subdued him, and they shot him dead. But as far as they were concerned, they were actually lying on an explosive device which could have blown them to smithereens. And I was glad that the justice system did not pillory them, that they accepted that there'd been a terrible mistake made, that if anybody was to blame, it wasn't them.
We have so many targets in the UK, across Europe as well, that I'm aware of, probably globally. So many jobs to be done and prioritised. It really is a logistical nightmare to know where to best use your resources, as you well know. The thing that strikes me is that the accidental shooting that happened, well, it wasn't accidental, but the mistaken shooting. The only thing that surprises me about it is it doesn't happen more often, because the general public probably don't realise how many times we, as a security service and police service, thwart terrorists and people of ill intent, people who want to make their point, people who want to cause havoc and terror. They're thwarted 99.9 times out of 100 by our very vigilant security services, who are working 24/7 to keep tabs on people and listen into the communications. So it's a wonder it doesn't happen more often, isn't it?
It really is. I did some work in the early 2000s with the anti-terrorist branch of Scotland Yard. I got to know quite a lot of the guys quite well, including their commander. He showed me a list of the operations they had and what they thwarted, most which never reached the public eye at all.
No.
Absolutely incredible. I had the highest regard for these guys.
The reason it never reaches the public eye is because it never reaches court. There's decisions consciously made to thwart these things right at the outset, to search the properties, get the gear off them, whatever it is they're doing, and thwart their plans at an early stage, because you can't afford to let them run, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's too many targets to let any of them run and try and keep tabs on them, surveil them, whatever it might be. It's far too risky. Mm-hmm. So the conscious decision in this country is to nip it in the bud as soon as you can. And of course that goes further than we've got time to discuss on this particular programme, about undermining the whole philosophy behind that, and the fact that terrorists are trying to nurture people all the time, children, young adults, people in mosques, people in different establishments. They're under lots of pressure, young people these days, to be radicalised.
And it's a huge job. And the thing is, it can spring up. I mean, you get an incident happening in the occupied territories of the West Bank or Gaza, Palestine. And then, as a direct consequence of that, you get some outrageous thing happening in Manchester or Bolton,
Yeah.
and you think, where's the connection? And of course, the connections are about radicalisation.
I suppose it's off topic just now, but just thinking about Trump and the way he's behaving and his posture, the ramifications of that kind of thing filter right through all our societies, don't they? It's very irresponsible, some of the so-called diplomacy that's going on.
So I think we'll have to wait a while to see whether he's actually a very clever man trying to disrupt and get people to pay attention and take responsibilities, or whether, as you say, he is totally irresponsible. The jury's out on that yet. We'll have to see how it develops. But as it presently stands, what is happening just now is the economy of the Western world is being reshaped. Because as we speak, people are saying, we're not going to spend money on social care, we're not going to spend money on prisons, we're not going to spend money on youth employability, we've got to rearm. And that has enormous social consequences going down the road. Enormous.
Yeah, in all respects.
Yeah.
So, we'll watch with interest, and no doubt it'll come up again on here.
It's more than interest, it's absolute fascination. However, I would say this to Crime Time Inc. people, don't be distracted. Listen to Crime Time Inc. as well as watch the news.
Tom, let's have a wee word from our advertisers here, will we?
Yeah.
Our third case this week was Peter the Painter. Now, this is the siege on Sydney Street. This is the first time I've listened to one of our deep dive team and not had a chance to re-listen to it because I didn't really catch the nuances of it. Is that a case you're familiar with?
Yeah, a very famous case, 1911. The thing about the siege of Sydney Street was that it's got so many modern resonances in that the people involved, it was all about trouble in the Balkans. And what are we dealing with right now?
Yeah.
It's trouble in the Balkans. And if you go back 100 years, where you go to the First World War, some of the people involved in this were actually connected to Princip, the man who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo and started the First World War. These were Latvian immigrants, but they were anarchists. And at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge boiling point. There was anarchists, there was Fenians, there was Bolsheviks, of course. The Bolsheviks were on the rise. We tend to think of Bolshevism as being only in Russia. But Karl Marx spent most of his life in London. In fact, I'm sure he's buried in London at Highgate Cemetery. There was an enormous amount of febrile activity going on. There was crime, terrorism, bombs going off in pillar boxes, and the police were really on the back foot. And then what happened in Sydney Street was a siege where a number of people, including a famous anarchist called Peter the Painter, and was holed up in this house in Sydney Street. And it became a media event. And there's all sorts of fabulous black and white photographs of the siege of Sydney Street. They threw a cordon round Sydney Street. There was gunshots. The terrorists or the anarchists had automatic weapons. They had automatic handguns, which of course was used in the Sarajevo assassination as well, but that's beside the point. So the police were outgunned, and there was a tirade of fire. Winston Churchill was the Home Secretary. He showed up, and there's pictures of Winston Churchill there with a silk top hat on, a big top hat, which looks most incongruous. And the Scots Guards were called out from Wellington Barracks, and they were there with their rifles. Policemen were there with a variety of weapons, including shotguns and all the rest of it. So anyway, after all this had taken place and all this firing's going on, the house that they were holed up in catches fire. And basically it catches fire, it burns out, and they find two bodies within the house, and they're not quite sure whose they were, and they don't know what happened to Peter the Painter, and they don't know whether Peter the Painter was actually in the house at all in the first place. The point about it was, and it was a spectacle, a public spectacle. And because photography and because the press were starting to get involved in these cases then, it was a media event. And that was what gave the siege of Sydney Street such prominence. I would have thought that the police thereafter would have learned some lessons from it because it was a complete debacle. It was one of the first set-piece media events. And that's why it gained all the prominence. But in terms of police operation and an armed besieged criminal situation, which is what it was a bit of a farce, as you might imagine.
Was this the one where the firearms, they were using Tommy guns? They were using machine guns on the police?
No, they didn't have machine guns. They had automatic pistols. They had semi-automatic pistols, which came in. The Browning automatic pistol was invented about 1910, and they were small, compact, and had tremendous firepower compared with the old single shot. The police and law enforcement authorities found themselves outgunned quite often by these automatic and semi-automatic pistols.
Not a nice position to be in, Tom.
No.
Okay, so that was Peter the Painter. Where did Peter the Painter come from?
It was just his name. It was just the name he was given, and I don't know whether he was a house painter or a painter. I think he was a house painter, but he was just known as that. But remember, a lot of these people from the Caucasus and from the Balkans, they had unpronounceable names, and so when they were living in London, they were just known as John the Such or Peter the Painter or whatever name. The whole background and history of Peter the Painter is shrouded in some mystery about exactly who he was, and was he killed in the siege of Sydney Street, or was he even there at all?
Our podcast team, our deep dive team, they called us the dynamic duo, by the way. I just thought I'd let you know that in case you'd missed it. They alluded to the fact that maybe the police and the authorities had invented Peter the Painter as a kind of distraction from their incompetence on the day. Do you ever think that kind of thing happens, Tom?
What never happened in Lothian Borders Police, Simon?
Yeah.
No, I think he was an early manifestation. I think he existed, but whether he was there or not, I don't know. Their intelligence was so poor and it was all very reactionary. But you've got to remember at the time, in London and in the UK, they were terribly afraid of all of this mayhem brought about by the disruption in other parts of the world. And we've just talked about the London bombings. Here was an earlier manifestation of exactly that same thing. Problems in the Balkans manifesting themselves in terrorist activities and violence on the streets of London.
Yeah. Tom, I'm kind of lingering on that case because I'm actually reluctant to move on to the next one because I remember it so well and it's so stuck in my mind from back in 2002, the murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, two schoolgirls murdered by the school caretaker, whose name I can hardly say, but I always remember the pictures of them in their Man United strips, two beautiful young girls, their futures and their lives taken away. The deep dive team did a good job, I think. Although they possibly let the girlfriend off the hook a wee bit, they maybe looked at it subjectively, which I find it difficult to do, objectively rather, because of my involvement at the time. But this changed policing as well, didn't it? And profoundly changed everyone's attitude towards intelligence and sharing of intelligence, which was really needed at the time.
Absolutely. Ian Huntley, Maxine Carr. I agree with you about Maxine Carr. The deep dive team, I think, were fairly gracious with her, saying she could have been a dupe. She could have been under the influence of Ian Huntley. I'm not so sure. It was a horrible case, and of course had terrible resonances for us here because of the Caroline Hogg, Susan Maxwell, Sarah Harper cases that we dealt with. It was awful. And what it did, it highlighted once again the weaknesses in our systems, the huge gap in intelligence for mobile offenders. Yeah. And if this is one of the lessons from Peter Tobin as well, who we were just talking about a minute or two ago. Peter Tobin took advantage of that as well. He was highly mobile, he moved around a lot, and his past did not catch up with him until it was too late for his victims. And that was the case of Ian Huntley. There'd been all sorts of problems with him. He was suspected of various sexual offences, and he just moved. He was just one ahead of the posse until at last poor Holly and Jessica were victims of his. Terrible case. And again, inadequate systems. Good people, good systems, hopelessly inadequate systems.
Let me ask you, Tom, 23 years on from this case, And we always say the thing that always comes out of these horrific cases and tragedies like this is, well, lessons will be learned. Every inquiry, everything that goes on, lessons will be learned. Maybe you don't know, but you'll know better than me. Do you think lessons were learned as far as intelligence sharing is concerned? For instance, the home system we've spoke about often on here, the computerised tools to help us investigate major crime, especially serial crime. Is that used in an intelligence format as well, where sharing of files is commonplace and we can tap into each other's intelligence sources online?
Yes, there is. And of course, there's a sex offenders database. That's the main thing. It's the sex offenders database. And you'll see people now being convicted. Sometimes they're quite minor crimes. And I think it's quite right, indecent exposures, things like that. They'll go onto the sex offenders register for a period of time. And as long as employees of schools do their due diligence and interrogate the sex offenders register, then in theory, Ian Huntley should not slip through again. Now, no system is foolproof, you and I know that. But there is a system in place now which, if adhered to, would actually protect against the likes of Ian Huntley getting employment with young children where he's got convictions or where he's suspected in other places. Now, the thing is, Ian Huntley wasn't only convictions, he was also on intelligence, and that's more problematic. But there are now systems of intelligence in relation to suspected sex offenders. So it's an awful lot better now than it was in that day. Whether it's foolproof, another matter.
Yeah, because it's something we're going to talk about as we move on here with the podcast is identification of perpetrators. The one I'm going to talk to you about is over 100 years ago when it was a different ballgame before we had the tools that we have now. But people are adept at changing identity now. It's a thing, isn't it? Because of the internet. People can reinvent themselves. And that makes our life much more difficult to track these guys moving forward.
Well, very much is. But back in these days, and even going further, I mean, we're going on to talk about a case from even earlier than that. It was very, very difficult then. And before fingerprints came in, so we're talking about the early part of the 20th century, it was almost impossible.
So people could give false details, false names, false dates of birth. We'll come on to that in a minute. Let's finish off with I don't even want to say his name, but the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. I suppose if anything good can come out of tragedies like this, it's that things change thereafter. And I think that's what happened as a result of these two girls, their murder. And the shocking way that he tried to cover it up as well. Remember, he tried to ingratiate himself into the inquiry. I think he spoke to one of the parents. And all the time he knew he'd gone and cleaned his car and all the rest of it. And I know that surveillance was a big part of this case as well, Tom, that he was surveilled. And that's how we knew that he had cleaned his car. He'd washed disinfecting the boot of his car. Didn't manage to get rid of all the evidence, of course, because that's almost impossible.
Yeah, that's right. It was an absolutely horrible case, but I'd like to think that some good did come of it. I'm sure it did.
Yeah. All right, Tom. And to finish on it, if nothing else, public awareness when it comes to your child's safety and all. Things have been changing, haven't they? It's no longer the case that kids get out to play willy-nilly like they did when we were younger. People are much more vigilant now, which is a great thing. And they've got their eye out for strange behaviour, for guys who stick out a wee bit, which Huntley didn't, of course. He was Mr. Normal, which is always a danger.
Yeah, he was charismatic, he was charming, and of course he had Maxine Carr as well to run interference for him. And this is where, when you get a man and a woman operating together, it is so dangerous. You know,
she gave him an alibi, didn't she?
Well, she gave him an alibi, but also it gives him a facade of respectability. We've seen that before with Brady and Hindley and Huntley and Maxine Carr, and I think she got off pretty light, actually.
Yeah, me too. So, moving to your neck of the woods now, not quite your time, maybe a few years before you joined, the Edinburgh Leith Outrages. And when I saw this, I thought, this could be anything at all. I think the whole place is outrageous, but there you go.
Well, what's interesting about this case is that we tend to think that cowboys and outlaws come from America. And that they're all out on the plains in the Wild West. But actually, when you look at it, there were just as many of these people in Australia where you're just back from. And this is an incredible story about a group of desperados who came from Australia to the UK, and then a couple of them made their way up to Edinburgh with the intention of robbing a bank.
Yes.
And they came up armed with their Bristol Bulldog revolvers. Now, this is significant because the Bristol Bulldog was a commonly manufactured handgun, a pocket pistol, but a powerful firearm, but a very, very low velocity gun. These two guys came up to Edinburgh, and right from the outset, they decide they're going on a rampage of robbery. And the robberies are incredibly inept. I mean, they wave down a horse and carriage and they try and rob that, and people can't believe what's happening and tell them to bugger off. And there's a firefight. Somebody gets shot in the arm, somebody gets shot in the leg. And a man, now this is interesting, a man gets shot full in the chest, but because he's wearing a heavy overcoat and it's a self-loaded bullet that doesn't have the velocity, the bullet doesn't penetrate the coat. The learning point there, Simon, is don't take your coat off. You never know when it might save your life.
Your great coat. Do cops still get a great coat? No,
I don't. They do, but I got one that looked like it'd be made out of a horse blanket. That's big heavy thing.
You get caught in the rain with that, Tom. It'd take you hours to get back to the station.
Oh, absolutely. It used to go stiff like cardboard. They ended up down in Leith. Now, at that time, the Edinburgh City Police was a different area from the Leith Borough Police. And Leith Borough Police was a tough outfit. They had to be, because they were policing the docks there, you know. There was only 70 officers in Leith Borough Police. And of course, by the time you split them up into shifts, there was about 20 on at any given time, or even less than that. But they were all tough, and they were all hand-picked for two things. Being able to handle themselves, because there were an awful lot of drunken sailors in Leith, but also they all had to be very good swimmers. And I've looked at some of them, I've looked at some of the adverts for Leith Police, and it says you're looking for fine young men, fit young men, etc., must be able to swim. And they used to take them open water swimming and all sorts of stuff. I mean, it was really hard going. So the Leith Police were not to be trifled with. So anyway, they went down, these desperados. They ended up down in Leith, and they ended up in a fight with the Leith Police and came off second. One of them, actually, there was various misfires with the guns, and one of them, to avoid arrest, shot himself dead. The other one was arrested. And
a wise move.
Yeah, I don't know whether shooting yourself dead or being arrested by the Leith Police. I don't know which would be the worst. The one gets arrested, then he gets 21 years in prison. And what was strange about this case was that he was taken away down south to be imprisoned. He wasn't imprisoned in Scotland. I don't know why that was, or whether there was more to it. But what's interesting about it was that there was such pride in the way that these Leith policemen had conducted themselves in this hand-to-hand fight with these guys who were armed with guns, that there were 5 medals struck, specific medals, and they are the rarest of police medals. A good friend of mine who is a collector of police medals actually has one, and we know where there is another one, and we would dearly love to know where they are. And funnily enough, one of them was in Leith Police Station, the old Leith Police Station.
We'll need to speak to our old pal George Barnsley about this.
Well, he knows all about this. George knows all about this. In the next few weeks, a search party, including myself, we've been invited down to the old Leith Police Station, and we're going to have a good rake around to see if we can find the other medal, because it's a fascinating story.
What is Leith Police Station now? Is it lying derelict?
No, it's still used, but like many police stations in Police Scotland, its future is very doubtful, and large parts of it are not fully used now. The whole estate of Police Scotland is in a sorry state of repair. I was out at Tullyallen last Sunday at an event, and even it's looking shabby. Now, you know, it was always spick and span, but there's just not been adequate money to keep the estate up to scratch. So we might find one of the surviving medals from the Edinburgh and Leith outrages of 1881.
That would be brilliant.
Yeah. In one small aside, show you what sort of guys they were. In one of their early robberies, before they got down to Leith, they managed to steal £4 and a hat.
Yeah, I heard that on the podcast. It just got a wee bit out of control that night, didn't it?
It was just one of these nights that started badly and fell away.
One of the things on our deep dive team, they kept saying how brave the cops were.
Aye.
And the lad on the deep dive team actually said, I can't believe that police were unarmed at that time.
That's right.
He doesn't seem to know that we're still unarmed at this time. And the cops do these things all the time with armed criminals, whether it be more commonly knives and weapons of other descriptions, but firearms as well. Generally, there's no armed officers within help distance at that time when it goes down.
Yeah.
So they were quite surprised at that, weren't they, because of their culture in America.
There's a lot of work. The Leith Borough Police ceased to exist in 1921. They were amalgamated with Edinburgh City Police. And I've got a lovely black and white photograph that shows the last parade of the Leith Police. And they're all marching along beside the police station in their uniforms. And I'll tell you what, a tough-looking crowd.
That's what Percy Sillitoe wanted to create, wasn't it? That's what he managed to do wherever he went, was to replicate that.
Percy Sillitoe would have been absolutely delighted with the Leith Police. They were right out of his mould.
I think what people don't realise, Tom, is that when you get a force of men like that, they had to be a certain type. They had to be swimmers and all the rest of it to cope with the ship. Strong men, drunk men, all the problems that the docks bring about. What people maybe don't realise is that you're not like that for your shift. You're not one of these guys for 8 hours or 10 hours a day.
No.
It's 24. These guys are absolutely off the wall, aren't they? Especially when you put them together.
Take off the uniform and they're still tough guys.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Brilliant. So our last case this week, Tom, a complete change of geography anyway, and timescale 100 years later, 1968. And this is probably the one I was talking about earlier on when I mentioned Mr. Trump, is that we're seeing instances across Europe and across the world of public disorder. And it's our politicians that are causing these things with loose talk, and maybe the media playing a part in it too. But this was the Democratic Conference in Chicago in 1968 when it all kicked off. And it seemed again like a progression of feeding each other, of the press, of different factions getting together, of the authorities maybe hammering down too closely. I'll let you tell the story of it that you've heard as well, and then I've got a couple of questions to ask you as someone who policed these type of instances over the years.
Well, we've talked about the Colin Pitchfork case today as being a good example of how to do things correctly, how to manage a case correctly. We've talked about Peter the Painter and how not to. And the Chicago riots, Democratic National Convention riots of 68, are a very good example of how not to control a crowd or how not to confront a crowd. And of course, you've got to lay this all at the door of the famous Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago, who was a Democrat, funnily enough. He wasn't a Republican, he was a Democrat. But he was a tough guy. But the trouble is, I don't think he was all that clever. He was just tough, and you've really got to be tough and clever to succeed. But basically, this is all against the background of the Vietnam War. It's against the background of the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's against the assassination of Kennedy. All of that's going on. It's a powder keg, absolute powder keg. But particularly what made this so volatile was Vietnam. Yeah. By 1968, the general population, particularly the liberal left in the United States, the students, were up in arms about Vietnam. And I mean, we had Vietnam demonstrations here too, in London. But over there, this became the very epicenter of all of the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Now, instead of recognising that, instead of facilitating demonstration, instead of controlling it, instead of trying to make breakout places for these demonstrators, instead of adopting a non-confrontational style, Mayor Daley did exactly the opposite. Funnily enough, there's no mention of the chief of police in Chicago, because it seems that Richard Daley, had complete control over policing, which of course, political control over policing is never a good idea. But anyway, he sent in the Chicago Police, National Guard, with batons swinging, this just in the wrong ground where there were no escape routes, and led to an incredible number of injuries and a full-scale riot.
You mentioned things in there that some listeners of Crime Time Inc. will be familiar with, because we spoke about crowd control and policing these type of events. We spoke about them before, but I think it was season 1 and maybe season 2. So I'm going to recap a wee bit of that just for some of the terms that you used there, which are becoming familiar to me, but they won't be so familiar to some of our listeners. And what they maybe don't realise is that we're very privileged here on Crime Time Inc. to have you on with us, because as Deputy Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders, and in the ranks leading up to that, a big part of your job was policing these type of events. We've spoke about football, we've spoke about all sorts of riot situations. Tell us a wee bit from your, and I think you just did, but explain in a wee bit more detail about how we and how you would look at that in the big picture, that powder keg as you described it, and how you try to minimise the danger of it and the chance that there's going to be a spark to kick it off. And if it does kick off to some degree, how you can compartmentalise it, how you can keep people safe during the course of it.
Well, first of all, thankfully, I never had to police anything like a full-scale riot like this. But there are very well-established rules for dealing with large groups of protesters. And you can easily turn a large group of protesters into a riot if you handle it badly. Now, the first thing is that what Mayor Daley did was he banned marches. He banned marches. You should never do that. Never do that. Because it's always better to know where and when the people are rather than not know. Because if you ban a march, and we did it once or twice in Edinburgh, to our regret, a big James Connolly type march, we banned it. And all that meant was that the marchers and demonstrators popped up all over the place, where we didn't know where they were and we didn't have adequate resources. So you're always better to deal with a planned event, because you can plan the route, you can plan your resources, you can put your snatch squads, you can have ambulances, you can have fire service, all of that stuff.
Horses.
You can have horses, you can have dogs, although dogs in public order are a bad idea. A lot of people used them, I never liked the idea, but the horses, absolutely great. So you can plan it, you can control it. You're always better to be in control than out of control and just being a hostage to fortune. And that's what happened in Chicago. They banned the march and they thought all the demonstrators and the students would go home to their beds. Of course, that did not happen. Always have a plan and have a backup plan. Try and do business with the protesters. Try and get them in, speak to them, facilitate them, because they've got a right to protest. But above all, be in control and plan it. Also, have your demonstration on good ground, on level ground, where they're not hemmed in by railings or motorways, because all you're doing there is creating a pressure point, almost like a pressure cooker that's going to blow. You've got to have a place for them to go.
That's interesting, Tom. Am I right in thinking that probably, 99% of the people taking part don't want any trouble? They just want to hold their placard, make their point, and if things do kick off, they want to get out of there as quickly as possible. Is that?
Absolutely. And I saw them in various demonstrations we had here in Edinburgh. You'd get a mother and a couple of kids come along to make a point with a placard, and all of a sudden they're caught up in this surge of people. And if we had barriers, what I would always tell officers to do was people like that, to facilitate them climbing the barriers, getting out of the way. Particularly young people, small people. You got folk. People used to bring dogs on these demonstrations, and you could see the dogs were terrified what's going to happen. People would come in wheelchairs. People would come with prams with children in them.
Yes.
You had to be cognizant of all that. But have a plan, pick your ground, pick your time, and I would never ban any march. Not because I didn't didn't agree at all with some of the reasons they were marching. That's not the point. It's bad tactics.
No. And you would use idiots like me to go in and be part of it and tell you what's happening on the ground.
Well, we couldn't. I mean, you'd have been a stick out in Edinburgh because of your disreputable dress and demeanour. They would have spotted you straight away. They would have said, "Excuse me, Mr. Wood, there's a Ouija here. He's lowering. He's lowering. Would you get him out of here? Well,
The criminals are complaining about
well, of
him.
course, absolutely, you're right. Of course, we had spotters, people who would mingle with the crowd. We had observers. That's why you've got to pick your route. You can put observers. You can have CCTV for evidence gathering. You could
Helicopter.
have a helicopter. We didn't tend to use helicopters because we could actually get heli-telly from buildings. Again,
Yes.
pick your route so you can facilitate all that. Much better to be in charge of it than not. And one of the mistakes that Daly made was that he saw it as not something to facilitate and control. He saw it as something to confront and fight.
Yes.
And fighting should be the last option, not the first.
Yeah. For sure, because it becomes a spectacle then, and it draws all the wrong types of people to it as well that just want to get involved. They've no agenda other than to commit crime, really, looting and all the rest.
You can guarantee that the person that's going to get hit by a police baton or run over by a police car, they're going to be the innocents who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the problem.
Thanks for doing that, Tom. It's not something that just any podcast would be able to tap into, is your expertise in these things. And I'm sure we'll come back to it time and again, especially in the current climate as things are so volatile across the globe.
Well, there's been a lot of very interesting research done on the dynamics of a crowd. A crowd of 1,000 people has a life of its own. And the psychology of understanding and dealing with crowds is actually quite an exact science and a very, very subset of psychology.
Right. Interesting. As always, thank you very much, Tom. The other thing I wanted to mention tonight was our live show, 27th of March, I think I mentioned it earlier, in the West End of Glasgow. Jane Hamilton, hopefully going to join us that night as referee or hostess or whatever we want to call her on the night.
Hostess, I hope, not referee.
You looking forward to it?
Very much so. I really enjoyed the last live event we did, and I'm looking forward to this one too.
And all I would ask is that you and our listeners keep tuned in to TikTok, whatever that is. But we're big on TikTok, you and I. TikTok, 60,000, it'll be growing by the minute, the amount of views. There'll be more things going up there over the course of the next few weeks. Our website, of course, our Facebook page, our Twitter page. People can get in touch with us in all sorts of ways. And I hope that they do and give us feedback, positive or negative, whatever they're thinking. Let us know.
Exactly. And if there's subjects they want us to talk about that we haven't uncovered, then we're happy to take it on.
Great stuff, Tom. I look forward to speaking to you next week.
Good night.
Good night.